Welcome, and thank you for joining our session on understanding and using the PARCC diagnostic tools. I am pleased to introduce Bonnie Hain, the Director of English Language Arts Literacy Design and Development for PARCC Inc., and Doug Savdi, the Director of Mathematics Design and Development for PARCC Inc.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to discuss with you how to use the PARCC diagnostic tools to support instruction. We're going to walk you through the basic design features for each of the subtests that are part of the diagnostic assessment, as well as how to use the reports that will be available to you for the diagnostics. First, let's start with a discussion of the guiding principles that govern all of the diagnostic tools. First and foremost, we want to ensure that the items provide evidence of student performance as well as student progress. We know that it's important to have data that informs instruction in real time, and each of the tools is set up to give teachers the information that they need to make day-to-day instructional decisions with immediacy as the students are completing the diagnostic tool assessments. It's also important to recognize that all of the items in the diagnostics are aligned in both content and cognitive complexity to the other tools that we offer throughout the PARCC assessment system. In English language arts, there are a number of different types of diagnostic tools. First, there is a reading comprehension assessment that allows teachers to select from both literary text and informational text tools so that teachers can really find out when students have strengths and needs in reading the two different types of text that students will work with. There's also a reading fluency assessment that allows teachers to find out how well students are progressing in their foundational skills. A decoding assessment allows teachers to find out more information about students in terms of their phonemic awareness and phonics skills. The vocabulary assessment, like the reading comprehension assessment, allows the teacher to find out about how well students determine the meaning of words in both literary and informational text. And then finally, there is a reader motivation survey that allows teachers to find out more about the reader-task connections so that teachers can help students select independent reading text materials in ways that support student motivation and engagement in the reading process.
And in mathematics, there are really two different kinds of tools available to educators. I'm going to actually start with our mathematics fluency assessment, which has items aligned to the fluency standards in the Common Core State standards, and allow teachers to take a look at both how accurately students are working items as well as how quickly they are working items, and both of those pieces of information will be provided to teachers when students finish the fluency assessments. And I'll say a little bit more about that when we get to the reports near the end of the presentation. The math comprehension assessment for this coming school year in 15-16 is actually constructed of over 45 different cluster level tests that teachers can use both before instruction as well as after instruction to see not only where students' strengths and needs are before they begin work with students in a particular area, but also how they've progressed after instruction has occurred within that given cluster. And I'll say a little bit more about that as well when we get into the math comprehension assessment. As we move into the 2016-17 school year, PARCC intends to create an adaptive version of the math comprehension assessment that will allow teachers even more flexibility in determining where students, again, have strengths and where they have needs across learning progressions. Next slide, please. Thank you.
On this slide, you can see the various subtests that are available as part of the PARCC diagnostic toolset. You'll see that there are, in fact, 5 English language arts literacy assessments, and you see the grade levels at which one can use the tool. So reading comprehension does have materials for grades 2 through 9, vocabulary grades 2 through 8, and then fluency and decoding and reading motivation survey also go through grades 2 through 8. And we'll talk more in just a moment about the specifics of each of these assessment tools.
And in mathematics, you'll see that the comprehension assessment runs grades 2 through 8, and there are actually 49 different cluster level tests that teachers can choose when it's appropriate within instruction to provide to students. And the fluency assessment lines up with grades 2 through 6, which is where the vast majority of the fluency standards in the Common Core are located. Next slide, please.
So let's talk a little bit about the design features for the reading comprehension assessment. First, it's important to recognize that the questions are designed to measure either student accuracy of comprehension or the student's ability to find and cite evidence from the text to support the ideas that they've comprehended, or both. This is really important because knowing whether students are accurate or able to draw evidence from a text, or whether they're able to do both of those, really will change the approach for instruction in the classroom. When students are not accurate, we know that students will need more work in the area of drawing conclusions and drawing inferences in particular, and also in moving into some close reading of words, phrases, sentences, and paragraphs. When a student is unable to cite evidence from the text to support the ideas for which they are able to comprehend, that close reading skill set becomes absolutely essential. So having that diagnostic information available to the teacher really will allow the teacher to make some better choices as they're designing classroom instruction to support grade level standards instruction for reading comprehension. Each of the tools allows for about 20 items. We do use authentic passages of varying complexity levels, and each form at a grade level is equal in difficulty with other forms. There are a small number of vertically linked items on each fixed form of the assessment. So, for example, on the grade 4 test, you will see a small number of grade 3 items. And this allows teachers to see how students might perform with prior grade level material. Starting in 2016, we will have an adaptive assessment rather than a fixed form assessment, and those vertically linked items will only be viewable by students who are struggling to answer the grade level items with accuracy and evidence. Also of note is that the teacher can choose whether or not they want to measure student reading comprehension using informational text or literary text. And that is helpful in terms of determining which set of standards students need the most work on, or which set of standards students are needing to have extensions on, because of course these diagnostics are available to help teachers get more information about which students need intervention work and which students may need acceleration or extension opportunities. On the screen, you're able to see one example of an item that we have in our diagnostic pool where the students are asked to demonstrate the accuracy of their reading comprehension. And here, when the student is asked to note an important difference between orcas and gray whales, the student's going to have to go in and notice they're not only going to have to figure out what the text says about orcas and what the text says about gray whales, but they're going to have to synthesize that information and put it together and integrate it to get that response. And that is aligned with the expectation at the grade level for this particular item. When we look at the next item, you'll see one of the examples of an item that measures both accuracy and the ability for a student to draw evidence from the text. So that Part A item does ask students to figure out what the text is mostly about in a particular set of paragraphs, and they're going to need to be accurate in their response. But then, notice in the Part B, they're going to be asked to find evidence, and that's, of course, Reading Standard 1, and that will allow the teacher to get better understanding of which skill sets the student has strengths in and which ones they're going to need support in. When you get to this next item, what I really want you to notice is the level of rigor and complexity of this item. In former assessments of reading comprehension, one might have seen items that really ask for students to simply find explicit information in a text and to simply recall what is stated explicitly in a text. If there was inferencing involved, it would be very much lower level inferencing that the standards themselves call for. When you look at this item, you'll see that the student is asked which sentences from the passage illustrate an important difference between the turkey and the other birds. Here in this item, the student has to first figure out what the characterization is of the turkey, what is the characterization of the other birds, and then what are the differences between those two characterizations, and then which sentence or sentences best expresses those differences. So you can see both accuracy and evidence are implicit in this item, and the student has to do what is a multi-step process to demonstrate their reading comprehension. What is important to note about this complexity of level is that in this case, when students are answering questions of this type, they are really demonstrating the same kinds of grade level skills that would be expected on the PARCC summative assessment. So when teachers get feedback and students get feedback from this kind of an item, they're really getting an accurate measure of where students' strengths and needs are in relation to the actual standard, rather than to a piece or a smaller grain size of the standard. So this is going to be much more predictive of student abilities and their progress towards mastery of the standard than some of our prior state assessments might have been, or than some other tests might have been previously. The design of the vocabulary assessment is similar to that of the reading comprehension. So you will see that the questions, again, are designed to give information about student accuracy of derived vocabulary meanings. Of course, that's within the context of a passage. It's not isolated vocabulary. And also the ability for students to find and cite evidence from the text. That is, students have to actually say what really was the context that allowed them to determine the meaning of terms that they are defining. The forms contain approximately 24 items. The passages are of varying complexity levels, and like reading comprehension, each of the forms is approximately equal in its difficulty with the other forms at the grade level. The forms are designed to measure reading information or reading literature standard 4, as well as some of the language standards. When you take a look at the first item that you'll see in a moment on the screen, you'll see again that these items mirror the difficulty and complexity of the items that would be equivalent to the vocabulary items on the PARCC summative assessment. When we take a look at the design of the reading fluency tool, you'll see that there are a large number of passages that have been designed to be equivalent in complexity. Half of the passages at each grade level are informational text and half are literary text. Students are asked to read repeatedly one of the passages until the student feels that he or she is ready to show that they have the ability to read with fluency. At that point, the teacher will use a stopwatch and a printed copy of the passage to annotate the passage where students may use a substitution or may skip a word or make some other kind of error in their oral reading. The teacher can also, with that stopwatch, determine the words read correctly per minute. The teacher has a rubric that allows them to determine student expressiveness and prosody. Since fluency is typically monitored no more than quarterly, one of the nice things about this particular set of tools is that there are sufficient passages available at each grade level to not only allow the teacher to monitor student progress in fluency, but also to use some of those same passages with the same quality of rigor for instructional purposes. And we know, of course, that we want our instruction of fluency to use the same kinds of passages with the same complexity level as those passages that we are using to monitor student progress. And so the teacher is going to be able to have examples of those texts that they will be able to use for instructional purposes. What is really helpful for teachers as they're using the expression rubric is to recognize that the bold language in the rubric really helps them to focus in on providing a reliable score by which they can assign expressiveness and prosody, and by which they can then monitor student progress through the school year. So as students are moving in their work in fluency, obviously we want students to be at that level 4 where they're reading primarily in larger, meaningful phrase groups, but we know that some students may be initially reading primarily word by word, and we're able then to watch that progress through the various levels and know with some certainty that students are making the kinds of progress they need in order to be strong comprehenders of text, because we know that students who are not able to read fluently are unlikely to be able to comprehend at the levels that they'll need to in order to master grade level comprehension skill sets as in the standards that they are working with. The decoding assessment has been designed to ensure that students have the phonemic awareness and phonics skills called for in the standards. The test measures skill mastery in 6 different key domains: CBC words, blends and digraphs, complex consonants, complex vowels, and then in 2 different sets of skill sets around multisyllabic words and decoding options, words recognition and inflectional endings, and affixes with syllabification. Each of the 6 domains has very specific skills that are measured within that domain, and one can find a document in the PARCC Partnership Resource Center in the digital library called Diagnostic Decoding List of Skills by Domain, and teachers can see exactly which skills are measured within each of those 6 domains. So it becomes easy for teachers as they're getting that data back to see which skill sets may need more work. Of course, being able to look at the types of items that students get correct and ones that they do not get correct also allows the teacher to get a better sense of where particular strengths and needs may be in order to ensure that students are picking up the phonics and phonemic skills that they need, again, to help them to move into the comprehension that will work for them. This test is adaptive right from the start, and it will allow teachers to see how students are progressing over time and to compare student mastery levels from one testing date to another. And this may be of particular interest to some teachers who are using this data for student learning objective and growth measurement within the school year around decoding skills. The items themselves are quite straightforward. You can see on this screen this first item, selecting the word in which C has the same sound as the C in city, is a traditional phonemic awareness item. Each of the decoding items has 3 answer choices rather than 4. And here you see an example of one of the multisyllabic item types. Another type of a tool within the diagnostics is the Reader Motivation Survey. The surveys are separated into grade bands. There is a survey for grades 2 to 3, one for grades 4 to 5, and one for grades 6 through 12. Students are given an opportunity to express through a series of survey questions what they think and how they feel about reading, and also how they view themselves as readers. And of course, the standards do call for teachers to look at the reader task connections in order to select text, and this survey data is designed to allow teachers to really get a sense of that reader task connection. You can see on this slide, here's an example of one of the survey items or actually 2 of the survey items that you might see on the grade 2-3 survey. And here is one of the items that you might see on the 4-5 survey, and then on the 6-12 survey. And you can see in the 6-12 survey item that, for example, the students can select more than one genre or content that they're interested in reading, and you can imagine getting for all of an entire class, or even at the as one moves forward, looking at this data across a school. Library media specialists, for example, or school teachers who are looking to build out their classroom library are going to have a better opportunity to really make sure that those libraries have the kinds of books that that students in their classes are interested in reading and interested in learning more about, and that allows for that motivation and engagement in reading that's so critical to developing lifelong readers, which we know is a prime goal. And with that, I'll turn over to Doug Sabdi to talk a little bit about math comprehension.
Hey, thanks, Bonnie. That's great stuff. Thanks for running through all the ELA literacy tools that are in the diagnostics. In math comprehension, there are a number of different design features that I'd like to note with everybody today. I've mentioned this a couple of times, but I'll reiterate it again, that the test is really designed around the Common Core State Standards clusters. And in fact, why don't we go ahead one slide, and I'll come back to this in a moment. What you see in front of you are all of the clusters that are available to give to students in the math comprehension assessment. And you can see the grade levels across the top, and each different color represents a different progression in the Common Core: number and base 10 operations, the fractions progression, operations and algebraic thinking, right? And they're all found in here with a particular emphasis on the most crucial supporting clusters from the content frameworks, as well as the major clusters from that document. And what's really nice about, I think, the design here is that teachers can not only determine where students have strengths and weaknesses within a particular cluster, but using this progression guide, so to speak, teachers can work their way backward to find out if a student needs some additional support in a particular progression, where in that progression the student was last able to demonstrate mastery of that content. And so while a pre-test, post-test use of these tools is still recommended, we also want to emphasize and encourage users to think about making use of these progressions in order to find out where students have strengths and building from those strengths as they scaffold instruction back up to grade level. So why don't you go back one, please? You'll also notice that each cluster level test has multiple forms, and that of course allows for multiple administrations if desired, and that each form has approximately 22 items in it with varying levels of cognitive complexity, and also these four forms these multiple forms allow teachers with the 22 items per form to not take much more than about a 45 to 50 minute block of time in order to have students work through these tests to make them more feasible in terms of an instructional day. You'll notice when you start having students work with these forms that there are a few items on each form that will be from off grade level, for example, grade 3 items on a grade 4 test. And that's to allow us to provide some vertical linking information in a vertical scale when this assessment becomes adaptive in 2016-2017. You'll also notice that there are some calculator and non-calculator items within the assessment starting in 6th grade, and when it is appropriate to use and not use those calculators is made clear as students work through the assessment. So why don't we skip ahead 2 slides, please. I'd like to show you a couple of examples of some of the math comprehension items. Here's one that aligns to an evidence statement that asks students to use addition and subtraction within 100 to solve 2-step word problems involving situations of adding to, taking from, putting together, taking apart, and comparing with unknowns in multiple positions. And so what I hope you see when you look at this item is, an item that's very similar to the PARCC summative assessment items, right? And this was obviously very intentional from the design phase on, so that students would and teachers would appreciate the systems nature of the diagnostic assessment to not only pinpoint where students might need some additional help or some additional acceleration, but also, gives kids an opportunity and gives teachers an opportunity to get a sense of how kids are progressing with respect to what that summative assessment looks like as well. Next slide, please. Here you'll see an item that, again, I think does a very nice job of making nice connections to, the cognitive demand and the rigor of the summative assessment only found here in the diagnostic assessment. I'm not going to read through the entire item for you, but you can take a look at it. What might be nice to recognize here is the standard or the evidence statement to which this item is designed to gather evidence is that students would use benchmark fractions and number sense of fractions to estimate mentally and assess the reasonableness of answers to word problems involving addition and subtraction of fractions, referring to the same whole in cases of unlike denominators. And of course, students have lots of opportunities to think through some of these issues as they look at this particular task. In the next task, in grade 7, we'll see a really nice item that asks kids to think about proportional relationships using multi-step percent problems. And here again, I think you'll see a lot of the same features that you see in the summative assessment. But of course, because it's diagnostic, right, what we're going to be able to point out to you is in real time where students are really doing well with some of these items and where they might need some additional support. In the math fluency tasks, right, which really focus quite specifically on the fluency standards in grades 2 through 6, you'll notice that that the items can be used to both test out the extent to which students can solve problems for accuracy, but also to determine how long it is taking students to solve those items, so that teachers can more accurately tune their instruction as they work with students. Again, each form contains approximately 22 items, and the forms are approximately equal in difficulty to other forms, allowing for multiple administrations as desired. And again, I'd like to make a comment about math fluency. This is a wonderful, useful assessment to get an understanding of where students are with some very specific skills. However, we hope that people use this assessment judiciously keeping in mind that, the purpose of math fluency is not only to make sure students know their math facts, which is unarguably important, but also recognize that the best use of those math facts is in putting them to use in more cognitively complex problem-solving situations. And do encourage folks to think about the math fluency assessment as a tool to help shore up student skills as they work with some of those more complex items, such as the Type 2 and Type 3 items on the summative assessment. Next slide, please. Here are some pretty straightforward fluency items, right, where we're asking students to multiply and divide within 100. You'll see on the report when we get to it that we do list out the sub-skills that students will have worked with on the fluency test because, as you know, in the standards, oftentimes those sub-skills multiplying or dividing within 100 are in the same standard. And here we did want to give you all an opportunity to see whether students were doing well or needed some additional help with either multiplication or division, not just both of them together. Next slide, please. And here we see a situation where students are subtracting a 3-digit number from a 4-digit number and a 4-digit number from a 4-digit number. Again, giving you an opportunity to take a closer look at where students are with respect to their subtraction skills. And then finally, we have a look at a couple of different division items, right? And here students are being asked to divide multi-digit, do division of multi-digit whole numbers. And here we have a 5-digit number divided by a 2-digit number. And in fact, this first task has no remainder, but task 2 does in fact have a remainder, which is fairly straightforward, that is, for students to go ahead and enter. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bonnie to kick us off on looking at some of the reports.
So let's take a look first at some of the English language arts reports. The first report that we're going to look at is the report for individual student reading comprehension. As I noted when we discussed the design of the assessment itself, students can focus in on either informational text or literary text. We get the same kind of information back. So what you're seeing on the screen is actually a report that shows how a student did on 2 different assessments, one informational and one literary. We get both the number of items that a student answered correctly as well as the total number of items and then the percentage. That's sort of global information for the teacher. But then you're going to see that detail by skill that really is the diagnostic data piece for the teacher, where we can see by skill, whether it's accuracy or evidence, how students did. And again, you can see number of questions answered correctly and percent correct. We know that a student who has that percent correct up close to 80% is going to be better prepared to meet the grade level standards where they are set for the end of the year. So that's the teacher's guide really provides teachers with some insights on how to use these reports in more detailed ways. So notice how easy it is to read these reports. That was purposeful. We know that teachers really want to get the critical data with immediacy, make some decisions, and move forward in their instruction. When you look at the vocabulary report, you're going to see that it looks really exactly the same as the reading comprehension. That's by design. Again, the goal is to get the information as clearly as possible and be able to implement it without needing hours and hours of training on how to use the results. When you look at the decoding report, you'll see those 6 categories. The teacher does get information about how the student did in all 6 categories. There is a numerical score. We want that score to be as close to 1.0 as possible. Students who have a score that is high enough and close enough to that 1.0, you're going to see automatically the teacher will be told that the skill has been successfully demonstrated. You'll see that when a student has not yet really mastered the skill set at the grade level needed. You'll see that it says additional instruction and practice is recommended. What's important to note is that the student who has a .2 is further away than a student who has a .45 or a .9. So as students maybe perhaps take the assessment a second time in a particular school year, even if a student still has, as a score interpretation, additional instruction and practice recommended, the teacher can see whether within each of these categories the student is in fact making progress. This is important, of course, as we are providing in particular decoding interventions to students. We know that it's so important that students are able to break the code in order to have that comprehension be available to them. We want to know that those interventions, even if a student isn't quite there yet, are really making an impact, and having that ability to gauge that progress within a particular year is critical for teachers, and they can see that in very clear terms in each of those categories. And remember that for each of those categories, the teacher can take a look at the skills that are covered under each of those categories and have a better sense of the kinds of skills students are progressing on and which ones they are not. The fluency assessments, because they are teacher scored, do not have separate reports. Teachers instead will be able to record their fluency data in their individual grade books as they go. Beginning in 2016, there will be an opportunity for teachers to upload the data into the larger data management system and see the fluency data next to the rest of the data that is available around the other diagnostic subtests. And then, of course, the Reader Motivation Survey provides data back with each of the students' responses. The teacher can see the survey, can see what the responses are. The responses are really broken into three key areas: students' perceptions about reading, their preferences around reading, and then their motivation around reading. So very good information for the teacher in that reader task piece. And again, it's not something that takes a real long time for teachers to collect that data and interpret it so they can really hit the ground running when they get that immediate data report back and can make instructional change day to day, rather than waiting on test results, which we know is critical for a diagnostic set of assessments. And with that, I'll ask Doug to talk a little bit about the math reports.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. The individual student report for math comprehension provides teachers with the % correct for overall items taken, as well as a number of items answered correctly in the total number of test questions. This allows, a really nice, both specific as well as general look at how students did with that particular cluster test. And the report also includes details on which standards students missed. Here, items answered correctly are given both as raw scores and % scores. And the standards that students may have missed here are given as actually the evidence statements to which the standards are derived. And I think what's nice to note here is if you look on the right-hand side of that report, you'll see the description library, which helps readers of the reports understand what those evidence statements look like, which standards in particular those evidence statements are gathering evidence for, and also some additional information on how to interpret the data that teachers are getting. You'll notice at the, probably about a third of the way down of the report, you'll see in triangular brackets EE-8.ee.a. That's the name of the cluster level test. Here it's 8th grade expressions and equations cluster A, so that you'll know exactly which report you're looking at for Manuel in this case. In the math fluency, actually we're going to stick with math comprehension, so you can see, the next slide's great, please. In this report, you'll see that teachers are provided with % correct for overall items and all of the additional details, including which standards students missed. And you can also get a look here about what it might look like for one student, Manuel, in this in this case, to have taken multiple different clusters. And again, all of the same information is provided regarding each cluster level test, but also allows you to get a single snapshot of it all together. With the Math Fluency report, which is on the next slide, information, again, includes percent correct, number answered correctly, total number of questions, and total time spent, and also provides, the ratio of correctly answered items by subskill, along with the time it took to answer each one of these questions. So again, you see the subskill in that first column, the fraction of questions that are answered correctly, as well as the time spent, allowing teachers to think through, is it an accuracy issue, or is it a speed issue that the student might be working with, and can tailor instruction appropriately, again, in service of being able to answer more cognitively complex items such as the summative type 2 and type 3 items. And with that, I'll turn it over to our host, Emily Alvarez, to wrap things up.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Bonnie, both so much for walking us through PARCC's diagnostic tools. To learn more about how to use these tools in your district, please visit www.parcconline.org/instructional-tools/diagnostics.